There is a version of you that knows exactly what needs to change. It is known for months, possibly years. It has sat quietly in the back of your mind while you made the same decisions again, while you returned to the same patterns, while you told yourself that this time would be different, and then watched, almost from a distance, as it wasn't. You are not confused about what needs to happen. You are not lacking information. You have read the books. You have had the realizations. You have felt the clarity arrive on a Tuesday morning like light through a window. And you have thought, with complete sincerity, that something had shifted, that this was the moment things would actually be different. And then, quietly and without announcement, you found yourself exactly where you were before. What is happening to you is not a failure of motivation. It is not a lack of discipline or willpower or self awareness. What is happening to you is something far more specific, far more structural, and far more fascinating than any of those explanations. And if you stay with me for the next few minutes, you are going to understand something about your own mind that most people never encounter in an entire lifetime of self improvement. But first, I need to ask you something uncomfortable. What if the reason you cannot move on has nothing to do with the thing you think you cannot move on from? Think about someone you know, or perhaps this is you, who has ended a relationship, left a job, moved to a new city, made a genuine fresh start by every measurable external standard, and yet somehow managed to reproduce the same emotional reality in the new context. Same patterns with a different person. Same dissatisfaction in a different office. Same internal landscape in a different zip code. The scenery changed completely, the experience did not. And if you have ever been that person, you have probably blamed the circumstances or the new person or your luck or some vague cosmic unfairness. Because the alternative explanation is one the mind resists with surprising ferocity. The alternative explanation is that you brought yourself with you. In 1968, a psychologist named Walter Mischel conducted a study that shook the foundational assumptions of personality psychology. He had spent years observing people across different situations and different contexts, and what he found disturbed him in the way that genuinely important findings always disturb the people who discover them. He found that people were remarkably consistent, not in their behavior, which varied, but in their patterns, the underlying architecture of how they processed situations, assigned meaning, and generated responses. Different room, different people, different decade, same architecture. What Michel was observing was not personality in the conventional sense. He was observing something that operated below personality, something that produced personality the way a riverbed shapes water. He was observing, though he would not have used this language, identity. And identity, it turns out, is the most powerful force in human psychology that almost nobody is talking about accurately. Here is what actually happens inside your brain when you try to change something about your life. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles conscious decision making, long term planning, and the rational understanding of consequences, makes a decision. It processes the available information, weighs the options, and produces a conclusion. Stop doing that. Begin this new thing. The decision is real. The intention is genuine. There is nothing performative or dishonest about it. In the moment of deciding, you mean it completely. But the prefrontal cortex is not running the show. Beneath it, structurally and functionally, sits a network of systems that are older, faster, more powerful, and considerably less interested in your conscious intentions. The limbic system, the basal ganglia, the amygdala, these structures process experience not as information to be evaluated but as pattern to be recognized, and they respond to recognized patterns with the speed and automaticity of something that has been doing this for a very long time. They do not wait for your conscious mind to deliberate. By the time you are aware that a situation is happening, these systems have already processed it, assigned it meaning, and begun generating the behavioral response that matches the meaning they assigned. And here is the part that changes everything. The meaning they assign is determined not by the situation itself, but by the identity they are defending. This is not a metaphor, this is neurological fact. Your brain maintains what researchers call a self schema, a consolidated representation of who you are, built from accumulated experience, repeated emotional states, and the stories you have told about both. This self-schema is not stored in one place in the brain. It is distributed across networks, reinforced by neural pathways that have been strengthened through repetition and protected by the brain's deep investment in what psychologists call self-consistency. The brain does not just prefer consistency, it actively works to produce it. It filters incoming information to favor evidence that confirms the existing self-schema. It generates discomfort, real, physiological discomfort, when that schema is threatened. And it interprets experiences through the lens of that schema, with a bias so pervasive and so automatic that most people never become aware it is operating. You do not see the world and then decide who you are. You decide who you are unconsciously, historically, through accumulated experience, and then you see a world that confirms it. But that's not the deepest reason you can't move on. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. In 2001, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio was studying patients who had sustained damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most involved in connecting emotion to decision making. These patients were, in every conventional psychological test, entirely intact. Their intelligence was unaffected, their memory was unaffected, their reasoning was unaffected. They could analyze complex situations with complete logical precision and articulate sophisticated conclusions about what the optimal course of action would be. They could not make decisions, not just difficult decisions, any decision. Given the choice between two options, they would analyze the problem indefinitely, generating reasons for and against each choice with equal clarity, without ever arriving at a preference. Damasio's conclusion was radical. Emotion is not the enemy of good decision making. Emotion is the mechanism through which decision making is possible at all. Without the emotional signal that says this matters, the cognitive system has no basis for preference. It generates reasons endlessly without resolution. Now apply this to the question of moving on. When you try to change a pattern, leave the relationship, quit the habit, relinquish the identity you have been carrying, your brain does not evaluate this as a simple behavioral adjustment. It evaluates it as a threat to emotional continuity. And emotional continuity, your brain has learned through decades of experience, is the signal that tells you who you are. The familiar pain, the familiar longing, the familiar cycle of hope and disappointment. These are not just feelings, they are identity markers. They are the emotional coordinates that your nervous system uses to locate itself in the landscape of experience and recognize the answer to the question it is always, beneath everything, asking, am I still me? This is why grief does not respond to logic. This is why knowing that a relationship was harmful does not stop you from missing it. This is why the most self-aware people on earth can understand exactly what they are doing and continue doing it anyway. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as dismantling it. And the reason it cannot be dismantled from the outside, through willpower, through new behaviors, through environmental changes, is that it is not located on the outside. It is located in the story you are living from the inside. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called ego depletion, and while its original experimental framework has been revised significantly since Baumeister's early work, the underlying observation it points toward remains one of the most important in the entire field. The observation is this: self-control, the active suppression of a natural response in favor of an intended behavior, draws on a finite cognitive resource. And the reason it is finite is not as originally proposed, because willpower is like a muscle that fatigues with use. The reason it is finite is more interesting than that. Self-control is cognitively expensive because it requires the continuous override of an automated system by a deliberate one. And automated systems, by design, are more efficient than deliberate ones. You cannot out-deliberate an automation indefinitely. Eventually, the deliberate system yields, and the automated system resumes. And the automated system is running your identity. This is what Nir Eyal understood when he mapped the structure of habit loops, and it is what he documented so precisely in his work on behavioral design. The hook, the trigger, the action, the variable reward, the investment is not just a model of how products retain users. It is a model of how identity retains behavior. The trigger is not external, it is internal. It is the emotional state that your self-schema generates in response to a recognized situation. The action is not chosen, it is produced by the automated system that knows what this feeling means and what it requires. And the variable reward is not pleasure exactly, it is confirmation. The relief of recognizing yourself. The brief, wordless satisfaction of the nervous system registering. This is consistent with who I am. Every pattern you cannot break is a habit loop in which the reward is identity confirmation. And you cannot break it by targeting the behavior, because the behavior is not the loop. The loop is the story running beneath the behavior, and the story is being told by something that does not respond to your conscious intentions. What most people never realize is that changing behavior without changing identity is not change. It is performance. And performance, unlike authentic expression, requires constant energy to maintain. This is why dramatic personal transformations that are built on willpower and behavioral strategy tend to collapse under stress, because stress is precisely the condition in which the deliberate system yields most readily to the automated one. Under pressure, you do not become who you decided to be. You become who you believe yourself to be. And this is where everything changes. In the mid-20th century, a man who had trained as a scholar of ancient languages and had spent years studying Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and the mystical traditions of multiple cultures arrived at a conclusion so radical, so counterintuitive, and so psychologically precise that it took another half century for neuroscience to develop the vocabulary to describe what he was pointing at. His name was Neville Goddard, and what he said, stripped of the metaphysical language in which he expressed it and translated into the framework we have been building in this conversation, was this: your experience of life is not produced by your circumstances. Your experience of life is produced by your assumption, the deeply held, emotionally real, consciously or unconsciously maintained sense of who you are and what is true about your relationship with the world. And the assumption is not a thought, it is a state. It is the settled, felt sense of a thing being true, the internal version of a fact that the outer world then, consistently and without exception, reflects back to you. What Neville called assumption, modern psychology calls self-schema. What he called the state, neuroscience calls the default mode network. The brain's baseline activity when it is not engaged with a specific external task, the network that generates the ongoing autobiographical narrative of self that underlies all experience. What he called I am, the declaration not of what you want to be but of what you are, is precisely the self-referential processing that the default mode network performs continuously, the quiet, constant activity of the brain telling itself a story about who is having this experience. And here is the most important part, the part that Neville returned to again and again in different forms across decades of teaching, and the part that modern psychology confirms with remarkable precision. You cannot change your experience by changing your thoughts. You change your experience by changing your state, by living from the assumption rather than toward it, by occupying the internal reality of the thing you want to be true before the external evidence exists to justify it. This sounds to the rational mind like wishful thinking, but it is not wishful thinking. It is neurological retraining. It is the deliberate, sustained practice of activating a different self-schema until the automated system recognizes it as home, until the neural pathways that generate the old story are no longer the dominant roots, until the identity confirmation that your nervous system seeks begins to be found in a different experience of self. The difficulty is not conceptual. Everyone can understand this. The difficulty is that the old identity does not yield passively. It resists. And the resistance is not weakness or failure. The resistance is the automated system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting the consistency of the self-schema that it has been running for years. The resistance is not the problem. The resistance is the signal that you are close to something real. Let me tell you about a pattern that researchers in attachment psychology have documented so consistently across so many populations that it has become one of the most replicated findings in the field. It is called anxious return, and it describes a phenomenon that anyone who has tried to leave a familiar emotional pattern will recognize immediately. The moment of leaving, the moment the decision is made, the change is initiated, the new path is chosen, is followed, almost universally by an intensification of the pull toward what is being left. Not a gentle nostalgia, an urgent, almost physical pull, a sudden magnification of everything that felt meaningful about the old situation. a sudden diminishment of everything that felt compelling about the new one. Most people interpret this pull as evidence. Evidence that the decision was wrong, that the feeling is real, that the thing being left was more significant than they had admitted. And many people interpreting the pull this way return. They call it following their heart. They call it being honest with themselves. What they are actually doing is responding to the automated system's most powerful tool, the manufactured intensity of the familiar at the moment of separation. The pull is not information about the value of what you are leaving. The pull is the automated system's response to the threat of identity disruption. It is the self-schema defending itself. And the people who move through it, not by suppressing it, not by arguing with it, not by requiring it to stop before they can proceed, but by understanding what it is and continuing anyway, are not people with more willpower. They are people with a different relationship to the discomfort. They have learned, somehow, that the discomfort is not a stop sign. It is a threshold. The most important move you will ever make in your own transformation is not the decision to change. Decisions are cheap. The most important move is what you do in the 48 hours after the pull arrives. Because the pull always arrives, for everyone, without exception. And what you do in that window determines whether the change was real or whether it was another loop in the performance, another story about almost changing that becomes part of the identity you are trying to leave. There is a term in cognitive psychology called the Zeigarnik effect, named for the Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who observed in the 1920s that the human mind has a disproportionate relationship with incomplete tasks. Waiters, she found, could recall the details of unpaid orders with remarkable precision and forgot those same details almost immediately upon payment. The mind, she concluded, holds open loops in a state of heightened activation, a low-grade but persistent cognitive tension that keeps the incomplete experience available, present, and demanding of resolution. Now consider what this means for the patterns you cannot leave. Every unresolved emotional experience is an open loop. Every relationship that ended without the closure your nervous system was looking for. Every version of yourself that you abandoned without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without the opportunity to genuinely grieve what it meant. Every aspiration that was shelved rather than consciously released. Every identity that was not transformed but simply suppressed. These are all open loops running in the background of your cognition, drawing resources, maintaining activation, generating the quiet but persistent signal that says, this is not finished. You cannot move on from an open loop by ignoring it. The mind does not close loops through inaction. It closes loops through completion, through the felt sense, however arrived at, that the experience has been received, processed, and integrated. And integration does not mean understanding. It means something more specific and more embodied than understanding. It means the experience has been allowed to complete its emotional arc. It means the thing you were in that chapter of your life has been seen clearly enough that it can be set down rather than suppressed. This is why the people who make the most complete transformations are not the ones who are most determined to leave the past. They are the ones who are most willing to face it without the protective layer of the story they have been telling about it. Not to relive it, not to be defined by it, but to complete it, to bring the full arc of the experience into conscious awareness long enough for the nervous system to register. This is finished. The loop is closed. When a loop closes, the identity it was sustaining loses its hold, not through force, through completion. And the most important part is still ahead because everything we have discussed so far, the self-schema, the automated system, the open loops, the pull of the familiar, all of it operates in the service of a single foundational mechanism. And understanding this mechanism is the difference between spending the rest of your life managing your patterns and actually living from a different level of yourself. The mechanism is this: you are always acting from a concept of self, always, in every moment, in every decision, every reaction, every interpretation of every experience. The question is never whether you have a self-concept. The question is whether the self-concept you are acting from is one you have chosen or one you have inherited. From your earliest experiences, your family system, your culture, your accumulated history of how the world has responded to you, and what conclusions you drew from that response, Most people, most of the time, are acting from inherited self-concepts. Concepts that were formed before they had the cognitive development to evaluate them, before they had enough perspective to understand that the responses they were receiving from the world were not objective measurements of their value, but rather the output of other people's own self-schemas, their own limitations, their own unexamined stories about what was possible and what was not. You were given a self-concept before you could consent to it. And then you spent the subsequent years gathering evidence that confirmed it, because that is what the brain does, it confirms. And the evidence felt real because it was real. Experience is always real. But experience is always also interpreted. And interpretation is always filtered through the existing self-schema. The evidence confirmed the concept. The concept generated the behaviors that produced the evidence. The loop ran. And what felt like the discovery of truth was actually the operation of a self-fulfilling system. Neville called this the assumption becoming fact. The modern psychologist calls it behavioral confirmation of self-concept. The name is less important than the recognition. The recognition that you have been living inside a story that was given to you, and that the story is not true in the way you thought it was true. It is not a revelation of who you are. It is a record of what you were taught to believe about yourself. And records can be revised. This is the shift. This is the move that changes everything, and it cannot be executed with the mind alone. It has to be done at the level of state, at the level of the felt sense of who you are. The practical reality of identity change is this. You do not change who you are by deciding to be different. You change who you are by inhabiting a different experience of yourself long enough, consistently enough, and with enough emotional reality that the automated system begins to recognize it as home. You do not push the old identity away. You stop confirming it. You stop generating the emotional state that the old self-schema requires to maintain itself. You stop, as Neville would say, living from the old assumption, and you begin deliberately and repeatedly, and without waiting for external permission, living from the new one. This is not visualization in the shallow sense of picturing what you want and hoping it arrives. This is something more precise and more demanding. It is the practice of occupying, in your imagination and in your felt sense, the internal reality of the person you are choosing to be, not the circumstances of their life, but the experience of self that person has. The way that person sits with themselves, the way that person relates to difficulty, the assumptions that person carries about what they deserve, what is possible, and what is true about who they are. It is the difference between thinking about a destination and standing in it. The brain cannot fully distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one at the level of the systems we have been discussing. The limbic system, the default mode network, the self-schema maintenance mechanisms. This is not a mystical claim. It is a neurological one, supported by decades of research in mental simulation, motor imagery, and cognitive rehearsal. The brain builds the neural pathways that support the imagined experience. The automated system begins to recognize the imagined state as familiar, and familiarity, in the language of the nervous system, means home. And what feels like home is what the system works to return to. You are not fighting the old identity. You are building a new home. And then you are choosing to live in it before the lease on the old place has expired. There is one more thing, one more layer beneath everything we have discussed, and it is the most uncomfortable one. And it is the one that most people stop just short of. The reason you cannot move on, the deepest reason, beneath the self-schema and the open loops and the automated systems and the pull of the familiar, is that some part of you is not sure you are allowed to, not because you are weak, not because you are broken, but because the identity you are carrying has embedded within it a set of permissions, a set of unconscious beliefs about what someone like you is entitled to experience, achieve, become. And those permissions were written by people who had their own permissions, their own limitations, their own stories about what was possible. They were written before you had a voice in the authorship. And they have been running ever since as the invisible ceiling beneath every attempt to rise, the invisible boundary around every attempt to expand. Moving on is not just an emotional act. It is an act of identity expansion. It is the claim that you are not defined by what has happened to you, not contained by the story that was written about you, not limited to the self that was constructed in response to what you were given. It is the assertion, not the wish, not the hope, but the settled, embodied, lived assertion that there is a version of you that exists beyond the patterns, beyond the loops, beyond the inherited permissions, and that this version is not a future possibility, but a present reality that is simply waiting to be inhabited. Neville's most radical claim was not about manifestation, it was about identity, he said, in different words and in different contexts across decades of teaching, that the self you wish to be is not something you are working toward, it is something you are working from. That the kingdom, to use his language, is within, not as a metaphor, but as a precise description of the location where transformation originates, not in the circumstances, not in the behavior, in the state, in the assumption, in the lived, felt, daily occupation of a different understanding of who you are. Carl Jung said something that lands differently now that we have traveled this far together. He said that what you resist persists, and what you accept can be transformed. He was not talking about passive resignation. He was talking about the difference between fighting the current version of yourself and understanding it clearly enough that it becomes possible to move through it rather than against it. The energy that goes into resistance is energy that cannot go into construction. And the construction of a new identity is not a part-time project. It is the work of every ordinary moment. The moment you choose to respond to a situation from the new self-concept rather than the old one. The moment you close a loop by completing it rather than suppressing it. The moment the pull arrives and you recognize it for what it is, not evidence, not truth, but the old system doing its job, and you continue anyway. So here is what I want to leave you with, not a strategy, not a technique, something more fundamental than either. You have been trying to move on from things, from people, from experiences, from versions of yourself. And the reason it has been so difficult is not that you are weak or broken or lacking in some essential quality that other people possess. It is that you have been trying to change the current while swimming in the same water. You have been trying to revise the story while continuing to live from it as though it were fact. The invitation, and it is an invitation, not an instruction, because instructions produce performance. And performance is not transformation. The invitation is to recognize that you are the author, not of what happened. You are not the author of what happened, but you are the author of what it means. And meaning determines the self-schema, and the self-schema determines the automated response. And the automated response determines the experience, and the experience confirms the meaning, and the loop runs until you interrupt it. Not with willpower, with identity. Not by deciding to feel differently, but by choosing moment by moment, day by day, in the ordinary, unremarkable moments that add up to a life, by choosing to live from a different understanding of who you are. Before the evidence arrives, before the external world reflects it back, before it feels completely real in the way that the old story feels real. Because the old story feels real because it is familiar, and familiar is not the same as true. The most powerful question you can carry out of this conversation is not what do I need to change? It is who do I need to be so that the change is natural, so that the behavior I want is simply the expression of the identity I am inhabiting, rather than the effortful override of the identity I am still secretly living from. Who you are is not what happened to you. It is not what you have done. It is not the pattern you keep returning to, or the loop you have not yet closed, or the story you were given before you were old enough to question it. Who you are is the one who is listening to this right now, the one who recognized themselves in what was said, the one who has known for longer than they have admitted that there is a version of them that is not contained by the current story. That recognition is not hope. That recognition is information. It is the most important piece of information you have, and what you do with it, starting in the next moment, in the next ordinary, unremarkable moment of your actual life, is entirely, completely, and always yours to decide. This has been the identity code. If something in this conversation shifted something in you, stay with it. The shift is real. What you do in the next 48 hours will tell you everything you need to know about whether you are ready to live from it,